AI is everywhere right now. Your phone has AI. Your laptop has AI. Even your web browser probably has some form of AI built into it. And most of the time, it feels like a feature that got added because companies felt they had to add it. It sounds impressive in a keynote, but once you start using the device, you rarely touch it again. So naturally, when we got the iFLYTEK AI Note 2, we wanted to see if it actually breaks that pattern. Because here, AI is not sitting off to the side as an extra feature. Instead, it sits right in the middle of how you take notes, how you handle meetings, how you read, and even how you think through ideas. So we spent time with it, and here's what it actually feels like to use. And right away, the first thing that stands out is the design. On paper, a 10.65-inch display sounds fairly large for a paper tablet. However, the moment you pick it up, that assumption changes quickly, because at just 4.2 millimeters thin, this thing feels almost unreal in hand, and at around 295 grams, it is still light enough that it does not feel like you are carrying a full device, but instead something closer to a slim notebook. So even though the display is bigger than most compact e-ink devices, it still slips into a bag without making itself known. And that balance is important because usually once devices go bigger, they stop being convenient. Here though, iFLYTEK manages to keep both sides in check. On top of that, the build quality supports the experience. Since it uses an aluminum frame with a rigid structure, there is no flex or hollow feel, even though the device is extremely thin. So overall, the first impression is pretty clear. It feels like a tool that prioritizes portability first while still scaling up the workspace. Before we talk about the display, it makes sense to start with the AI experience, because that is really the core of what makes the iFLYTEK AI Note 2 different. Now this is where things shift quite a bit, because most devices tend to add AI on top of existing workflows. However, here it behaves differently. For example, take meetings. Normally you are trying to listen, understand, and take notes at the same time, which naturally creates friction. So instead of forcing you to balance all of that, the iFLYTEK AI Note 2 starts recording and transcribing everything in real time. And importantly, it supports 16 languages for transcription along with 11 languages for translation, which means it adapts across different environments. But what really matters is what happens after the meeting ends. Because instead of giving you a raw transcript, the system processes everything into structured summaries. So key points, action items, and important takeaways are already separated and readable. And as a result, you are not spending time rewriting information later, since most of it is already organized. Then on top of that, GPT-5 integration takes things further. Because now, AI is not something you open separately. Instead, it becomes part of your note environment, so you can expand ideas, summarize content, generate drafts, or continue conversations without switching context. And then there is AI Search by Circle, which works in a very direct way. You simply circle a phrase or idea, and the system immediately brings contextual answers around it. So instead of jumping out to search externally, information comes directly into the same space where you are already working. And because of that, research starts to feel more continuous, rather than fragmented. Now, once you actually start using it, the screen becomes the main focus. Here, you are looking at a 10.65-inch flexible e-ink display with a resolution of 1920 by 2560 and 300 ppi. And while those numbers sound impressive, what matters more is how it behaves in daily use. Because text looks sharp, handwriting looks clean, and everything maintains that soft, paper-like finish that e-ink is known for. At the same time, since there is no front light, the experience stays closer to real paper rather than a simulated screen. So in bright environments, it actually feels very natural to read and write on. And as you continue using it, the larger size starts to make a real difference. For example, PDFs feel less cramped, annotations become easier, and layout-heavy documents become more readable without constant zooming. Then, once you bring split screen into the mix, things become even more practical, because now you can read on one side while taking notes on the other, which naturally turns reading and writing into a single flow instead of separate tasks. Now, moving into writing, this is where the device starts to feel very immediate. Because the stylus uses Wacom EMR, there is no charging or pairing required. So instead of thinking about setup, you simply pick it up and start writing. And once you do, the experience feels surprisingly fast. With iFLYTEK claiming under 20 milliseconds of latency, and with real usage matching that feeling closely, the ink stays tightly aligned with the pen tip. So very quickly, you stop noticing the digital layer altogether. At the same time, the surface resistance adds just enough friction to mimic paper, which keeps the writing experience grounded. However, what really changes the experience is what happens on top of writing, because instead of just capturing ink, the system starts interpreting intent. So when you circle a line of text, it becomes a task. When you mark something, it becomes structured data. And when you add a star, it becomes a priority item. At first, these feel like small shortcuts, but as you keep using them, they start replacing manual organization entirely. So instead of sorting notes later, structure starts forming as you write. And then adding mind mapping into this workflow makes it even more flexible, because instead of forcing ideas into linear pages, you can branch thoughts naturally as they come. Now, even though this is clearly a note-first device, reading still plays a big role in the workflow. And here the experience actually holds up very well. Because the larger 10.65-inch display gives documents more breathing room, long reading sessions feel less compressed and more comfortable. At the same time, page turns feel responsive enough that they never interrupt flow, which keeps the focus on content rather than interaction. And when it comes to file handling, things stay flexible, since it supports PDFs, EPUBs, and Office documents, and also allows imports through USB, Cloud Sync, and wireless transfer. Moving content in and out remains straightforward. However, what ties it all together is split-screen reading, because now you are not just consuming content. Instead, you are reading on one side and actively responding to it on the other, which naturally turns reading into an active process. Under the hood, the iFLYTEK AI Note 2 runs on an RK3576 octa-core processor with 4 GB of RAM and 64 GB of storage. And while that may not sound powerful in a traditional tablet sense, it is clearly tuned for a different kind of workload. Because in actual use, everything feels smooth where it matters most. Writing feels instant, navigation stays responsive, and system transitions feel clean. And since it runs Android 14 with full Google Play support, the device feels more open compared to many e-ink systems. So you are not locked into a closed ecosystem, and instead you can extend it with tools you already use. That said, this is still not a general-purpose device, because once you push it into heavy app usage or multitasking, it becomes clear that this is not the primary design goal. Instead, everything is optimized around structured work. Now on the power side, you get a 4,000 mAh battery. And in practice, this is where e-ink starts showing its advantage. Because once you begin using it for notes, reading, meetings, and general organization, charging stops being something you actively think about. With iFLYTEK claiming up to 14 days of typical usage, that range feels realistic depending on how heavily you use AI features and connectivity. And since standby consumption is extremely low, the device can sit idle for long periods without draining meaningfully. So overall, battery life simply becomes part of the background experience rather than something you manage. After spending time with the iFLYTEK AI Note 2, the direction becomes pretty clear. Because this is not trying to replace a laptop, and it is not trying to compete with a tablet either. Instead, it sits in a very specific space, where reading, writing, meetings, research, and idea capture all come together in one place. And because of that, the experience feels very intentional. The writing is fast and natural, the display is large enough to support real work, and the AI features are deeply integrated rather than added on top. Of course, there are still trade-offs. Since there is no front light, usage depends more on environment. And while Android support is stronger now, it is still not meant for heavy general-purpose use. But those limitations feel expected once you understand what this device is focused on. Because at its core, the iFLYTEK AI Note 2 is not trying to do everything. Instead, it focuses on doing one thing very well: helping you capture information, structure it, and actually use it later with less friction. So if you're interested in the iFLYTEK AI Note 2, it is currently available at up to 20% off during Prime Day. Use the exclusive code in the description. Thanks for watching. If it was helpful, hit like and subscribe for more reviews. Drop your questions or thoughts in the comments.